pure nominalism. You take those four things about the universe and you then just give them the names of the Trinity. And my answer to that is, I don't care. So what? Not helpful in the slightest. So I'm sure that's not where you're going. So why don't we take the things that we just agreed on and see if you can tie it back to the Trinity?
This is scissors, and this is also scissors, right? Two different scissors. They're both scissors, right? So the question becomes, is there something that exists that is a scissor?
Is there an essence that makes it?
Ouisa, or essence, the wholeness, the oneness, the Godhead in English. And then the hypostases, or the persons, which is three. Right? So I have a oneness and a threeness. I have a unity and a multiplicity.
Mosaic. All of a sudden your eyes light up and you see, otherwise you have a monad. And a word is not a monad. A word is a mosaic. Everything is a mosaic, full of multiplicity. Some have a lot less clear and easily articulable multiplicity, and others don't. But a naming is that. A naming is the unity of the multiplicity that allows you to see it. And then all of a sudden, boom, it's an epiphany. It's the frame that you, boom, see the mosaic. All of a sudden your eyes light up and you see the larger image. But everything is that way. But a lot of times with naming, because of the technology of writing, we've forgotten that words are a mosaic, that language is a mosaic, that there's a many-to-many correspondence.
Right. Is there a universal scissor that these are instantiations of? Okay? So nominalism was the idea that, no, there's no actual scissor, right? We just call this a scissor. A name is just a name, right? And there's nothing that inherently makes these two scissors in some manner related in some way, right? Well, that is nominalism, and it's major foundation, philosophical foundation of what became the Enlightenment, right? Is no, things are like only that which the material exists, that which we can touch, that which we can feel. Like this idea scissor, this concept scissor, right, it's just a word. And words have no true effect in the world. That's nominalism.
Entrenched nominalism. And nominalism is the idea, I'm trying not to use too much, trying not to use...
And again, nominalism has been a baddie around, guys like Rod Dreher and, people who, there's a lot of people who've been complaining about nominalism for a while now.
Too much, sorry, but nominalism...
I remember when I had first become a believer, I was obsessed with trying to figure out what was the best possible thing that I could say to a non-believer. I thought because I had been an atheist, a non-believer for most of my entire life, that it was almost like, well, who else is going to do it? I have to be the one to do it because I've got this personal experience with that. So I listened to this video between Jim Rutt and Jordan Hall the other day, and it was...
the persons are in a relationship with each other, and their shared relationship is the oneness. Now, I've moved from a purely philosophical construct to the beginning of a theological construct, and noticing that there's, in fact, a mapping between those two.
I would say that's true for any fairy story that included the Trinity, right? That there's nothing yet that you've been able to put on the table that would say that's anything other than a story. In fact, Kant would actually, this is where my readings of Kant were quite useful, that existence is not a predicate, right? It does. One could tell the story of 1 and 3 and essentially the Trinity story. And as a nice little Catholic boy when I was young, I tried to get my head around the Trinity, never quite did. But it's just a story so far.
I'm actually not sure what I follow. That in some sense, I didn't do anything more than make the movement from the ontological primitives on the philosophical side of the conversation, which I think we'd gotten to the point of recognizing that that wasn't a story in as much as it was the most basic or necessary and sufficient thing upon which we begin to build the rest of reality.
Yeah, at least put it this way, I could accept it as a reasonable description of the basis of reality. I could quibble about little things, but close enough. But then how do you make the jump to this particular set of things?
First, I'm doing a half jump.
Okay.
So this is what I was saying, like we're moving philosophy to theology. When we did the first Roman numeral, I noticed that a number of times we kept talking about the question of to what degree is this just a story and to what degree is it real? And what you're doing...
To philosophy. We also have two different approaches here. We have nominalism, which emphasizes the many, i.e. nominalism just names things because it's the particulars that all that matter. There's no forms, there's no transcendence to everything. But on the opposite side of the equation, we have idealism. No, the form is all that there is. Everything is one. Have you ever heard anyone talk about the fact that everything is one and matter and reality is merely an illusion? Idealism. They're getting rid of the particulars in favor of the universals. Oh, speaking of which, let's go ahead and put that on here. The particulars are the many. We can go back to Plato and Aristotle and argue about the particulars versus the universals. Where's the realm of forms? And how does the realm of forms interact with us? Again, the problem of the one and the many. In some systems emphasize the particulars and other systems emphasize the universals. Or we can take this into the realm of knowledge. Induction is primarily done through science, and science is done through the many. We look at the particulars, we do experiments, we arrive at knowledge ground up, bottom up. And deduction occupies the other side. We argue top down. We argue from first principles down to below. I think, therefore I am. And that's deductive reasoning. And you guys know I love Pajot's language. We're just going to map this onto heaven and earth. Of course, earth is the many and the one is heaven. Okay, we've got our symbolic categories of heaven and earth, and these map right on top of one another. Now, the thing I want you to see here is that this tribalism is perpetuated by virtue of the fact that both of these systems devolve into reductionism. What is reductionism? Reductionism seeks to say that everything can be reduced down to this one lens or this one way of looking at the world. So you can look at the world through the lens of the many or the particulars or induction, nominalism, immanence, or earth. But you have reduced. You are reductionistic in this way. Or you can look at the world through the lens of the one, transcendence, idealism, universals, deduction, heaven. And we map that lens and we say, this is the foundation bedrock of reality, and everything else can now be seen through this lens. I, as a Christian, reject reductionism in all of its forms, and it exists over here and it exists over here as well. We are not reductionists, but here's my problem. Protestants for a very long time have actually functioned as reductionists in their lives. They say they believe in God, they say they believe in heaven, but in reality, they live their lives in a reductionistic way. In this sense, they occupy the realm of the many. They just live down here amongst their many doctrines and their many rules. They erect a closed system out of which they can derive all of the doctrines of the faith through the Bible. And now that we've got our closed system, we are actually able to explain everything reductionistically. In this sense, fundamentalists are no different than new atheists because they both start from a reductionistic frame. Pragmatically, but still, it's reductionistic. What I think we need to be doing in Christian theology right now is embracing all of this holistically. This is actually done through realism, okay? Metaphysical realism. Now, So that I'm trying to navigate between two hard or difficult things. That I'm saying, we don't want to be too extreme over here or too extreme over here, therefore realism. Not the case. This is not the kind of realism that I am advocating for. That would actually be simply another form of reductionism. Instead, I am advocating for realism from a both and perspective. What do I want to do? Let's add back in the second dimension. Rather than talking about everything one-dimensionally, I actually want to talk about everything from a two-dimensional frame. And realism helps us to occupy the space between the one and the many. It actually puts the one and the many together and helps us to navigate this space in a way that is consistent with both realities. This is not reductionistic because it occupies both spaces. I recently had a conversation with a friend of mine, Father Hugh, and I'll put the link to our conversation down in the description below. And he taught me about a concept called hylomorphism. Hylomorphism says the one and the many are united. Okay, the forms and the particulars work together in a seamless way. If I can give an example of it, this is the best way I can try to illustrate it. Okay, form and matter come together in a single complex or composite. The particulars have the form built into them. All right. And so if I was to look at this form matter composite, think of it like a ball, top down, I would see the forms, truth, beauty, goodness, etc. This is the essence. All right. But if I was to look at the form matter composite bottom up, I would see the accident, the individual person. Okay. The whole point is that the form matter composite actually is a both and. It brings together in a unified way the one and the many. This is the heartbeat of realism, and I think that this is a thoroughly Christian way of looking at things. Part of the reason I'm going into this is I believe that metaphysics is something that is uniting a lot of different traditions right now. And a lot of people are still getting caught up in these debates that are reductionistic, trying to make everything reduce down to either the many or reduce down to the one. But I actually think that hurts us. Hear me clearly. Realism, properly apprehended, destroys tribalism. How so, you might ask? Well, I am not advocating for a realism position that somehow is a via media, a middle way between the one and the many. Instead, I am advocating for a realism position that subsumes the one and the many, because I refuse to argue on one-dimensional terms. Instead, we go into two dimensions, and the one and the many are all subsumed under the banner of realism. We get all of it at once. This means that I can read authors from the many camp and glean something from them. Why? Because I think the many is true. But I can also read authors from the one camp and glean something from them. Why? Because I think the one is true. I believe it's a both and because I'm a realist. And just because they haven't put all the puzzle pieces together in the same way as me doesn't mean I can't glean something from the very good work they've done on the specific puzzle piece they've been identifying. One of the things that you're going to find if you start viewing the world in this way is that not everybody is going to get it. I'll be reading a nominalist author. They have some great ideas, very thought-provoking. But somebody will come up to me and ask, what are you doing reading that nominalist? Aren't they an atheist? Yes, but I know where their ideas go. I'm not reading them for their atheism. I'm reading them for the other insight that they're bringing to me. I'll be reading an idealist. Somebody will approach me. What are you doing reading that idealist? Isn't their sexual ethics suspect? Again, I'm not reading them for their sexual ethics. I know where their ideas go, even if they don't. I understand the larger framework in which it might fit, even if they don't have that insight. I don't need them to understand the whole frame for them to understand a specific part of the frame and be able to give me some details about that.
Both logic and physics, i.e. in this case theology, that is the proper place to look for that kind of an explanation. By its very nature.
Yeah.
It's more fundamental.
The Ruddian take would be reality is what subsumes physics and logic and lots of other things, not theology. Theology is just some fairy story somebody made up because they're afraid of the dark.
Qualitatively different.
Yeah, this the complex of a large part of this tree, then things about psychology can't violate physics. So for instance, we found a bunch of people in the woo side of physics It's talking about cosmic consciousnesses that we're all part of, right? And laws of physics would rule that out. And so if you accept physics...
The laws of physics would rule out cosmic consciousness?
Yes.
I don't think the laws of physics would say anything about cosmic consciousness. The laws of physics would just say, I don't even understand what that means.
And again, remember, the difference between science and theology is science always says it's contingent and that inevitably part of the story is wrong and perhaps massively wrong. But the
theology is the discipline of reality. That's what theology is the discipline of reality. And now we're going to move to Roman numeral 3, which is really neat.
Let's do a little bit more on 2 yet, because I'm not at all convinced that you've said anything actually about 2, unless it's a very, very weak nominalism that the things that are true about the universe, categorically true about the universe, it's one, it's unfolded, it had a beginning, or at least a time that was very different from where we are today. If you want to just call those the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, great. But what the hell does that add to the discussion? Nothing.
Well, we got to get to Roman numeral 3 to get that.
The beauty of interrupting is, I shouldn't, complain about Jordan Peterson interrupting John Vervaeke when I just do it again and again and again.
I guess it just reminded me of so many things. It reminded me of how I was when I had first become a believer. I thought that I had to have the perfect response to everybody. And it was essentially like my duty, that because I had that experience of being a non-believer, an atheist, whatever, that somehow I was in a better position to, not even that I was in a better position, I was in a position that because I had that personal experience, that I then had to be the one to evangelize in that particular way. However, I was extremely careful and have been and still am. But listening to this show and watching Jordan essentially pour his heart out, which is what he did, he's obviously put in a tremendous amount of thought into what he's saying.
So you did all those things without a nominal belief in the Trinity, without a series of words or ideas in your head that you identified with the Trinity.
An explicit rejection of the Trinity. And
as an idea.
And even further, that this is where it gets really radical. In my investigations of religion when I was 11, I came to the conclusion that if the Christian God actually exists, he's the bad guy in the story.
So you had a whole series of narratives that were in your head that you developed a certain stance or posture towards. And some of them were things that you had been able to extract from stories that you had heard. Some of them were things that you had extracted from behavior of other people in the Christian church.
That Gibson undermined in a very powerful way nominalism, the idea that reality is ultimately based on individual spatio-temporal objects, and that all relations between them are just mind-dependent projection. And you can have the Kantian version. And Gibbs
and theorems that provide a science of geometry, which then in fact can be mapped onto the objective world. The way they do this is by having the capacity for spatial representations. It's not something about the external world that they go out and discover is Euclidean. It's that their own spatial mode of representation is itself and of necessity Euclidean, and that's what they bring to bear in the construction of the science of geometry, and that's what turns out to be, oh happy day, something that lines up with the objective world, with the world as understood by science. So these are arguments adduced in support of not only the fact of the pure intuitions of time and space, but their necessity, and in fact their ability to match up with the objective world. It's not an accident that they match up with an objective world, because our engagement of the objective world becomes possible by virtue of these very resources. It's what we bring to the situation. So no surprise when we recover our own aesthetic and cognitive resources in our knowledge.
Gibson basically undermines that. He says, no, there are real affordances are real relations. They're not in the object. They're not in the subject. That's why I hesitate to call it objective. I don't know if that's quite the right word, because he's trying to say no, because affordances aren't object centered, and in that sense they aren't objective. They to my mind, they bind the subject and the object together, and they undermine nominalism, and they say there are real relations. Once you get the idea of real relations, you are starting to move towards the eidos, the Platonic eidos. I don't want to use the word form, because whenever people hear that, they think shape, and that's not what I'm talking about, right?
That all the other stuff we're doing, if we talk about an object, we're actually talking about something which is actually our first order imagination. Any object is a function of an act on our part of decontextualization.
It's obviously a coarse graining, right? You give the example of science. You say in the pure form, science eliminates all other things and concentrates on one variable. Of course, we know that's not even, can imagine some Greek atom all by itself in the universe without relationship. But in terms of...
Except one thing.
What?
Your imagination. And that's really important. See, what happens is, I'm going to zoom in on that because it's really critical.
Okay, let's do it.
When we do the thought experiment of imagining an atom without any relationship, we are doing the thing that you just said complexity says you should never do. We are endeavoring to pretend that our imagination is not the actual content of the relationship that atom is having. We are imagining it. We are present, and our imagination is present with the atom that we are imagining, highly non-trivial reality, because it allows us to, to pretend, right? To pretend a wide variety of things that are actually nonsensical. They are, in fact, actually just words, as opposed to being real. The reality is the whole sentence. Jim Rutt is currently imagining that, right? And then finish it out. And that's what it is, particularly in the West, find ourselves in, is that we try to eliminate the first half of that sentence.
Which is exactly what you mentioned. All right. So for anybody who doesn't know, right, realism is basically the question of saying, I look out into the world, you look out in the world, every human being by default looks out into the world and we see structures, right? We think in terms of genus, of species, animal, human, common properties, bipedal, or, that ball is red and that ball is red, whatever it is. As well as these abstractions like numbers and, logical sets and things like that. And the question is, when the mind looks out and it does that, it can't stop doing that. It always does that. When it does that, does it do that because those structures are real and it's abstracting, pulling out of the world structures that are really there and identifying something that's real? If you say that, you're a realist, right? Or is it that the mind just needs to organize things, and so these are mental fictions that it projects on a world that really isn't organized, right? It really isn't that it's broken into these sort of genus and species and common properties. These are all just sort of mental fictions to impress order, to impose order on a world that really isn't that way in itself. And if you say that, that's nominalism, from the Latin nomen, for names. They're just a bunch of names. And
I would imagine.
My biggest from reading comparative religion. I read a whole series of, admit it now, encyclopedia entries in two different sets of encyclopedias on all the world's religions.
Okay.
And I extracted a pattern from that, which is that religion is some shit somebody made up for the purposes of controlling other people.
It's like, oh, it's just stupid book written by men to control other stupid men. That's what it's for. And so I read through the book of John, right? That's the one he's like, hey, read the book of John. Okay. And read it. And I think I read it a couple times. Then I read all the Gospels. It's like, I guess I thought I knew the story, but I really didn't. And you start to pick up on some of the things of like, some of the really hard things Jesus asked you to do, right? Pick up the cross, pick it up yourself, right? That kind of stuff. And it's just like, this is a horrible way to try and con people into controlling them. And it was sort of like my first real step back of like, man, if I was going to invent a religion
I go one step further and say it wasn't necessarily invented, but it soon evolved to be a mechanism of control of other people. And that's all it is. Makes perfect, in my later use, I would say, makes perfect game theory sense. You could map them in a nominalist way to a construction of the Trinity as described in the Nicene Creed, and I would argue a very limpid way. It's a mapping, yes, it's logically consistent within the language games we know, but that's not at all the argument I thought you were going to make, which was to then land all that and say that then makes the literal Christian God as story told under biblical literalism necessary, that God, not a word game mapping of the nature of the universe to some concepts, but rather the actual thing itself that's described in the Bible, word for word, not a single word of it can be wrong, of course. Biblical literacy, it says so right on the webpage of your church, that you haven't even come close to describing the logical necessity of all that stuff.
I beg to disagree.
Okay, either that, or we're just in agreement that, yeah, the sort of a Spinozan type or Einstein kind of God is fine and dandy, but it's not particularly annoying and it's not prescriptive.
Oh, annoying and prescriptive. I love how we actually ultimately at some time kind of uncover the things that are under there. So, like I said,
I guess this was like 2018, something like that. Started going to this little church, YMCA, and I don't know. I met my first, like, he called himself this, so I can say, hey, my first annoying Christian friend. Okay, that's who he was. He was my first annoying Christian friend, but in a good way, right? But he was the first one to actually kind of challenge me, and you know, hey, let's go out to lunch, whatever, all this kind of stuff. And, you know, he's a worship pastor, you know, so it's like it's kind of his job a little bit.
Way you just said it strikes me as exactly the equivalent of John Vervaeke's religion that's not a religion.
Well, this is why I said, I think he and I had that conversation. I said, hey, John, I found out that the religion that's not a religion is, in fact, the thing that's often called Christianity.
So there's the explanatory gap, right? As you know, I've been, once I got the chance to understand it, when I did those, watched 50 hours or Fully Human. And that's all great, but I don't need no Father, Son, and Holy Ghost to do it. God damn it.
Well, I mean, I think that if we work backwards over the conversation that we've had,
stinking shit in the Bible. You know, I actually did read Genesis. This is, I don't know, about 40 years ago, side by English, Hebrew, and I worked through it for 2 weeks, just the book of Genesis. And I've got a pretty damn good idea about how the book of Genesis works and how it's essentially a pastiche of various random stories. I mean, the creation myth is in there twice. There's 2 gods in there, not one thing. So either you haven't said much, but which we can agree on, or you have yet to make the case.
So now we're on the biblical.
Is there anything real there, or is that just words? To say that objects are relational and relational implies objects, I'm not sure I see any useful distinction there.
The argument is actually that this is the most real. So it's not just words, but in fact, even the notion of nominalism, that we can talk about things in the terms of just wordness, is already a consequence of the substance ontology, but that. And here I'm kind of invoking Forrest's thing about reality. Here's trying to get that. I noticed that the groove of an objective substance sensibility had been so deeply carved in me, in my mind, in my way of my basic, how do I say it, like below my conscious level of understanding, that I kept importing a substance ontology without recognizing I was doing it. So this notion of, it's not just that relationality is real, not just words, but rather that when we even want to begin talking about reality, we are in fact actually talking about relationship. And that
nominalism is that there isn't anything inside of a thing that makes it to be what it is. That what our names for things are just what we call something. That was not very clear. Basically, there's nothing intrinsic to the tree that makes it a tree. The only thing that makes it a tree is the fact that we call all of these things which appear similar to us to be a tree. They just have these similar appearances, but what draws them together isn't anything intrinsic in each and every single different instance of a tree that we can encounter. What draws them together is just the pattern recognition happening between our ears. Now, there was all sorts of fringe views, all sorts of crazy ideas floating around the Middle Ages, as there are in every civilization. But nominalism was not one of these. And despite its condemnation by the church, it flourished in the universities. And so I think by the time you actually get to nominalism manifesting itself as a philosophical system, there's already been this tendency in the culture to view things as the parts first and the whole second, right? That when we look at a tree, when we look at a dog, we see all of the individual parts first and seeing the whole second. That right there is I think the foundation of how science works. Is it takes things apart, it takes materials apart, it takes phenomena apart, and looks at it according to all of these very discrete categories, so it can reduce it to variables that we can manipulate so that we can get data out of it. I think this was a habit of mind that developed long before the first scientists began actually explicitly doing this kind of experimentation.
So the second person of the Trinity subtends that. So every story is ultimately a variation on the theme of the Logos. Does that make sense?
Yeah, what Alexander Bard calls narratology.
I don't know what that. I'm not familiar with it.
Doesn't.
In that same way, everything that is of this structure of unity, multiplicity, and relationality is from the triune God. So that's the argument that I'm making.
That's a giant leap off the cliff.
If you get the idea that the second person of the Trinity, the Logos, subtends the entire universe of all of narratology, which, by the way, includes not just narrative, but in fact, incarnation in general. Should we make it that way? Should we take those two steps? Or
here's my objection. I think Kant would agree with me absolutely that it's a leap backwards for which there's no justification.
Somebody comes out here and they say, Dwayne, I'm stronger than you are. Some guy comes out here and he says, I'm stronger than you are. I'm like, well, that's a pretty bold claim. I don't know that you're justified in making that claim. And so we get some weights out, and I get on a bench press, and I bench press my 1 rep max. And then he lays down on the bench, and he bench presses 100 pounds more than I do. We get up from there, and I say, you know what? Your actions have justified your claim.
We have existence. We have stories. That doesn't mean that there is a being inside, or a being, something inside of a circle called the Godhead, called the Logos, that is somehow related to all this stuff. I mean, there could be a Platonic form, if you want to be. Kant specifically warned against that move, right? To invent abstractions. It's a very human-centric view of the universe. And I think the thing that all such explications miss is the universe existed long before there was consciousness or language and life itself. And again, remember, I think the difference between science and theology is science always says it's contingent and that inevitably part of the story is wrong, and perhaps massively wrong. But the
predominant in Pinker's Enlightenment model. Pinker is a representative of somebody who is defending modernism without, I think, appropriately understanding his commitment to nominalism and the implicit, right, the implicit ways it makes possible romanticism and other things like that. So
holds Peterson, Vervaeke, and Peugeot together is they believe that the structures of this world are not arbitrary. And I think a big part of Jordan Peterson's effectiveness as an evangelist was that he was able to convince people deeply that there is a pattern and a structure to this world. And the reason traditional values are the way they are is because of the patterns and structures of this world. And of course, Jonathan Peugeot walks right into that and continues to elaborate it and fill it in with Christian beliefs and Orthodox beliefs. So that's basically what's been happening. But
I've noticed, because I'm insecure and need constant affirmation, is Paul will mention me by name. He has never made a clip of something that I've said from one of my live streams. It's always everyone else.
I think just sort of denouncing nominalism, it's sort of like complaining about the Protestant Reformation. Oh, the world would be better without the Protestant Reformation. Maybe. Maybe not. But I don't think it was avoidable. And you're likewise not going to somehow wind the clock back before Occam or Scotus or whoever you're pointing to as the bad guy, even before the Protestant Reformation. I think what we tend to be doing is trying to get fittedness, some optimal grip in terms of our maps.
As far as we can go right now.
Well, I think it's pretty straightforward to argue that it's actually as far as you can go within the domain of science, because science has underlying in its epistemology the notion of experiment, and one can't in fact do experiment on why the laws of physics the way that they are. You can do math, and you can try to use your math to give you an explanation, which is fine, but we're no longer doing science, we're doing math. And it's important. This is why string theory got lost in the noodling it got lost in, right? It maybe mistook math for physics.
Well, keep in mind, though, that science is not just experiment. It's also analyzing found data. Think of all the botany and zoology that was done without experiment that led to the Darwinian theory. So
association between observation and theory.
Yes, yes. And experiment is one class of sort of forced, cleaner versions of that. But you can also do science by just observing the world. We obviously don't do experiments with stars. What we don't have yet, and this is what I thought we would get to, is we have a story about these three components within the whole of the Trinity. We have an analogous story about the universe, but no connection between the two.
I'm having a hard time understanding how you mean no connection. So if I were to say, like,
people, there's no culture. With no people, there's no ideas, there's no wisdom, there's no books, there's none of that stuff.
You
have to go back
nominalism
right here into the human mind.
Yes.
And the human mind is still rooted in largely the primitive past.
Right.
Um,
you're just expressing nominalism. This is.
I am kind of a nominalist, I think.
Yeah. You are. I mean, I hope you're aware that postmodernism is post-nominalism. So most of our universities have been, in a way, captured by critiques of nominalism.
Well, I understand that, but I like I said, I don't read a lot of philosophy because I think a lot of it is absurd. And
this thinker named Alfred Korbowski and said he was a super genius. I'm like, who's that? And he wrote this book called Science and Sanity, and he basically argues the following, to take 900 pages and condense it into 2 sentences violently, is that human beings, it is just as important the framework, or he talks about semantics or structures of thought that we operate in versus just the information. Because he makes the example where he says, imagine you were trying to do modern cosmology or mathematics with Roman numerals. You were stuck in that symbolic. He said, you go crazy. You couldn't keep sanity, right? That literally the symbolic you choose impacts the kind of thoughts you can think. And if you encounter things in the world and you don't have a symbolic that would fit that, it will lead to insanity. And so what he's trying to argue for, he really focuses on semantics, kind of that sort of world, but really he goes to war against something called what he calls identification. He's basically looking to update Aristotelian logic. And he's like, Aristotelian logic has really gotten us to trouble. And he really convinced me that we needed some sort of framework that made relations, processes, stuff like networks real. Otherwise, we would go insane. Which also plugged into a lot of the work I did on David Hume from like Norm Kemp Smith and Donald Livingston, where he starts the Human Treatise warning that basically there's something, he calls it philosophical melancholia, would be unleashed upon the world unless people figured out a way to make idea and common life relate with one another. And all of his thought experiments, deconstructing self and all of these things are basically showing, hey, at the end of the day, ideas have to be in a relationship with some sort of percept, or else you're going to have philosophical melancholia, which basically we could associate with the meaning crisis. But here's the problem. It really wasn't until Owen Barfield that I felt like I found a really robust metaphysics to actually do what Korobowski and David Hume were trying to get at, right? Because like I was convinced of what Korobowski was saying, but the project he went about doing it, I wasn't convinced worked. But what you see in Owen Barfield is a metaphysic or a philosophy that actually could give you a legitimate new way of understanding the world that would help you avoid some of these melancholias or insanities that Mr. Korobowski was talking about. And really, it's hard to forget the rainbow example when you come upon it. Like, that's the most famous thing. If anyone knows about Owen Barfield, you know about the rainbow thing.
Whoa, that's a full rainbow. All the way. Double rainbow. Oh my God.
To talk about rainbows, you're talking raindrops. Okay. Right. What we have is a model here of a raindrop.
And a raindrop.
Woo! Oh, wow! Woo! Yeah! Oh my! Oh my! Oh my God! Look at that!
You would turn on the sun over there. Capture the sun in here.
Have here the sun.
It's starting to even look like a triple rainbow. Oh my God! It's full on double rainbow all the way across the sky. Oh my God!
Spreading out of colors. Oh, look at that! You've created our own little rainbow right here.
You'll see it go blue, green, red, and then disappear entirely. And the point is you're currently 42 degrees away from the direction that the light's shining in from.
What does this mean?
Postmodernism, I think, is more absurd than most. So I don't spend a lot of time reading it because it doesn't make it makes no sense. I mean, it clearly denies things that are true, right? Mm-hmm. Science doesn't make progress. Everything is like up for grabs and all this crazy stuff. That's clearly absurd. So I don't think, but that's the problem with philosophy in general. It's just a problem.
No, that's not a problem with philosophy. That's a problem with postmodernism. That's like me saying it's a problem with science. Like, bad philosophy is bad philosophy, just like bad science is bad science.
Well, yeah, I understand that. I would tend to agree with you on that. But look, postmodernism is no worse than Hegel. Postmodernism is no worse than Heidegger.
I would tend to disagree with you, but I'm just wondering in terms of relevance realization, right? You're right now you're talking about the problems with this little corner or the Jordan Peterson sphere, but it's not like we people who are having these discussions are like running Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, whereas post-nominalism has overtaken American universities as a whole, including MIT, to my surprise.
Well, yeah, that's a disaster. I don't think that's happened in China. I don't think that's happened in other countries. It seems to be a Western disease.
Yeah. Why do you think that is?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I would.
The beauty of interrupting is, I shouldn't, complain about Jordan Peterson interrupting John Vervaeke when I just do it again and again and again. And
getting back to philosophy and nominalism and whatnot, I would just say that we're kind of in a cul-de-sac. We've made a deal like Faust, and science is the only way forward. We have no other way forward. Going back to mysticism and magic, is not going to help us. It's
Well-
going to be a disaster.
I think, I mean, as far as relevance realization, I think you're completely focusing on something that is obviously less problematic than everything else we've talked about right now.
Instead of relevance realization, why don't you just say how I rank order something as important?
How I
because
priority ranking, I think you have a very poor ranking of priorities.
Well, that's your opinion. I mean, so what do you think? What do you think's wrong with my ranking of priorities?
I think that bad ideas overtaking MIT as an institution is far more hazardous to our society than what you think is happening here.
So you think that they should have courses in demonology at MIT, and that would solve
I
it?
would prefer that to courses on Foucault.
Well, yeah, Foucault's an idiot. I understand that.
However, it doesn't matter. Really, it doesn't matter. So much of the time, it does not matter. Because when you listen to that show, both of the people, their positions had been made before the conversation ever began. And even with that one, I'd almost say, what was the conversation? Right? Was it? I wouldn't even call it a conversation necessarily. It was Jim Rutt asking Jordan Hall to give him the reasons for why he doesn't believe, and or provide the type of argument that would be enough, like an argument that is good enough for Jim Rutt to change his mind. Now, I know both of these people are extremely intelligent. They're both extremely intelligent people. And I think what you come to realize after so long of thinking about this thing is that there is no argument to be made, right? There's nothing I can really say ever to convince somebody else to become a believer. It is just simply impossible. Okay, I won't say impossible, but I don't think I need to work on the perfect argument. I don't think I need to come up with the most salient, logical formulation for how you get from non-believer to believer. I don't know how to do that. And I'm not going to waste any of my time doing that. Because really, if somebody's truly going to change, they have to be at threshold. Okay? There's this concept.
Clients have to actually want to change or nothing happens. And the same is true for other relationships, not just the client and hypnotist relationship.
Change happens if, and only if, a person is at what we call threshold.
Called threshold. And it's used in any kind of change work sessions. Effectively, if you're not coming to the table wanting to change, then that conversation isn't a conversation anymore, right? It's just Jim Rutt listening to Jordan give his best possible explanation for why he believes. And I don't know.
There are 3 simple tests to determine if someone is at threshold.
Here they are. Something has to change. It has to be me. And it has to be now.
Let's have a look at each component of the threshold test.
Let's start with something has to change.
This one is pretty obvious, right? If someone does not consciously realize that a particular change is important to make, it's not going to happen.
Someone who's overweight but not particularly bothered by the situation isn't going to change.
Someone who smokes but doesn't care about the effect on his health isn't going to quit.
And someone who doesn't love their job but still tolerates it isn't going to find new employment.
It has to be me.
There are two meanings to this, and both are important.
First, the person who's considering making the change has to be the one that actually wants the change. The husband whose wife wants him to lose weight because she doesn't find him sexy anymore, he's unlikely to change without wanting that change himself.
And the child whose parents are nagging him to stop biting his nails or sucking his thumb, it's the parents who want the change, not the child.
Second, this means that people have to take responsibility for the changes that are going to happen in their lives. If a client wants to stop fighting with his wife all the time, he can't put the blame on her and expect her to change. He's the one who has to do the changing.
We call this being at cause, meaning you're the one causing the change.
The opposite of this is being at effect, meaning you're being affected by something rather than causing it yourself.
Okay, the third component of threshold is it has to be now.
This is often the missing component, the one thing that stops people from actually changing. They know they need to make a change and they acknowledge responsibility for the change, but they're just not ready to do it yet.
A guy we know is constantly putting off critical changes to his personal wellness. He's obese, he drinks too much, he consumes substances that harm his well-being, and his ability to be a great father to his kids.
And yet he constantly says things like, I know, I've got to change. I can't go on like this. Keep bugging me, guys. I need to hear this. Next year I'll start fresh.
So he's got 2 out of 3 components of threshold, yet he's simply not going to change.
So what do you do with this information?
Now that you understand threshold, start noticing the excuses people make when you're listening to them talk. What changes do people avoid? Which component of threshold is missing? Tune up your calibration skills by noticing where people get stuck.
Oh, Jim, and I don't know Jordan, but you can clearly tell from this video, or whatever, you can tell from this interview that, you know, Jim has an entire worldview that's built on not being a Christian. I mean, that much is extremely obvious. And so, to me, that whole conversation, it wasn't much of a conversation. It was just 2 people talking past each other. That's what it was. It was 2 people talking past each other, and it just kind of makes you think.
3 later. But so you asserted it, and I provide some counter arguments. But anyway, you asserted it. So in your chain, that one could be stipulated.
Imaginative story, because there's so much attention direction going on in that story that the story itself can't help but be the product of an editor. I'm not going to get anywhere through this video today. And we know that now. Again, this is all the cognitive science. All the implicit selection of what we call facts in order to create this great chain.
It's hundreds of years later. So what is the great chain of being? In the Middle Ages, they believed in a highly structured universe. It was ordered because God made it that way. Everything was organized hierarchically. That means it has clear levels of importance, from lower things to higher things. Things that were spiritual were at the top, and things that were just material were at the bottom. But everything was interconnected like a chain. Now, the idea of a hierarchically ordered universe came from the ancient Greeks. But during the Middle Ages, Christian theologians incorporated these ancient philosophical ideas into their worldview. Drawing on what they found in the Bible, they came up with a divinely ordained hierarchy, with God at the apex, followed by angels, humans, animals, plants, and minerals in descending order. So angels are at the top, after God, of course. They are spiritual beings, and they serve as messengers or intermediaries between God and humans. People generally understand angels to possess superior intellect, power, and purity. Then come the humans. We hold a unique position in the great chain of being. We are made up of both body and soul, material and spirit. This duality places humans in a transitional place between the spiritual and the material realms. Humans, then, are a bridge between the divine and the earthly. Animals are the next step down. Although they possess physical bodies and can exhibit instinctual behaviors, they are thought to lack the soul or rationality or higher consciousness that we humans possess. The plants follow the animals in the chain. They are living organisms, but they lack sensation, consciousness, and mobility. Plants were considered as less developed and less significant than animals in terms of their position in the hierarchy. And on the lowest rung of the great chain of being is all the inanimate things. Things like minerals and rocks. They are devoid of life, or consciousness, or volition. These are the least of things and are considered the furthest removed from the divine. Now, when we go into a little more detail, things start getting even more interesting. Let's isolate the human segment of the chain. All of humanity is arranged hierarchically as well. The king is, of course, at the top, and then the higher nobility, and then the lesser nobles, down through the tradesmen and the peasants, and down at the bottom of the list was that person who later would be called the Bedlam Beggar. It was a hospital for the mentally ill in London in the 16th and 17th centuries. It was notorious for its harsh and deplorable conditions. The patients had to support themselves, so they would go out begging on the streets of London. The term Bedlam itself came to be synonymous with chaos, madness, or confusion. My mom used to holler down the stairs about the Bedlam in the basement when we kids got too loud and rambunctious. The animal segment had the lion at the top, and what we find at the bottom makes some sense. It's an animal, but it doesn't have too much mobility or sensation or consciousness. It's an oyster or a clam. The top bird was an eagle, and in the number 2 spot was an owl. And the top tree is an oak. The oak tree was really important in England, the place where our language comes from. They built all their ships out of oak. And this is why we think of the oak still as the king of the trees, because that's how they thought of it in England 300 years ago. It's stuck in our imagination, and we've inherited it down through the generations through our language. Gold was at the top of the metals, and you know what number 2 is. Silver. And lead was at the very bottom, the lowliest of metals. Among other things, alchemists worked very hard at physical transmutation. They were trying to change lead into gold. Both were heavy and malleable. How hard can it be? Turns out it was really hard. The spheres go in here somewhere as well. This is the term for celestial bodies. The sun was at the top, and what was next? This one's a little harder for us, but medieval people would right away have said moon, and they would tell us that the earth was at the bottom. So the great chain of beings shows up in our writings now and again. Anything in the great chain of being can be analogous to anything in the same position in another segment. You see, kings, lions, eagles, oaks, gold, and the sun, etc. can be symbols of each
of material cause and effect through time, and then the other cause and effects that come, the psychological cause and effects. And again, even the rest is history, that as they continue to try to figure out how did the First World War start? And of course, this isn't that long ago. This is only 100 years ago, 110 years ago now. It's tremendously well documented.
Again, remember, the difference between science and theology is science always says it's contingent and that inevitably part of the story is wrong and perhaps massively wrong. But the current standard model is that there was an origin event about 13.6 billion years ago. The standard model claims it was a singularity and that inflation occurred. Frankly, I'm a little skeptical of both of those, but there was some origin event early where the entropy was far lower and the density was far higher. The only things that existed, probably not even particles or atoms, is very soon, within 3 seconds, helium and hydrogen and a teeny bit of lithium came into existence through the unfolding of the laws of physics at that temperature and pressure. Eliminate the lithium, it's probably not relevant to the story. It's not very heavily relevant. And then the helium and 80% helium, hydrogen, 20% helium, exploded outward, and then gravitation pulled parts of it back together to form what later became galaxy clusters. And then within that became galaxies, then that became stars. Because of the nature of the laws of the universe in our universe, fusion then occurred in some of those stars, the larger ones. In that fusion, hydrogen and helium became converted to all the elements up to iron. larger stars in a very specific size range, too small to become black holes, too big to hold together long term, became supernova under straightforward laws of astrophysics. And in this supernova, the heavier elements were created. Why does all that matter? Well, it turns out life on Earth requires some of those heavier elements. Our life absolutely depends on several elements higher than iron. And so this unfolding, which occurred, and it's thought that the sun is at least a third generation star and possibly a fourth generation star. So it was seeded, at least in part, by the ejecta of supernova. And so this increased complexity keeps ratcheting up. And then the very specific experience of our sun with its mix of elements, including some heavier ones, produced an Earth which had the elements in it that it had. And then a weird thing occurred. This is very interesting. Early in Earth's history, there was a collision, it's now thought, with a planet the size of Mars. I mean, this was one violent motherfucking event, right? And run the numbers. It's relatively unusual for that to happen. Really, really unusual. And the result is the moon. And may have been an unusual amount of mixing of the heavier elements from the center of the Earth to the surface, which then provided a substrate for more complexity to eventually bootstrap itself up to something called LUCA, the last universal common ancestor, of which you, I, yeast, bacteria, and anything else that's within our tree of life are descendants of LUCA. So that's the physicist emergentist view of the story. This is where the next step will be. So far, physics does not say why the laws of physics are as they are.
Right.
As an area of investigation, string theory attempted to answer that question so far has been a miserable failure at that particular point. And while there's some speculation, like, things like Lee Smolins' evolutionary universes, where universes come out the back hole of black holes with some Darwinian jiggling.
Of me, do you pull out the chains? Do you push into constant aching each and every day? Do you wish that you loved me?
Why even have a conversation at all? Honestly, why have the conversation at all? I think they would have had a far better conversation if they could find that ground to stand upon. You have to have something that you're both engaging in to even have a useful conversation, or a good conversation, a relational conversation. It's the whole psychodynamic loop thing, right?
Hypnotist and subject enter psychodynamic relational loop with each other, and trance is the result. So now if we see it as a relationship, a communication loop.
It's the same thing. It's you talk, I listen, I give you indication that I'm listening. Yep. I talk, you listen. I can get visual cues, eye contact, as Jonathan would call it.
When you said eye contact, I heard icon.
Yeah, well, no, that's the point. Because when we're talking about embodiment, I was really interested in the idea of embodiment being a principle of reality, where everything, including non-material things, everything has both a body and a identity, or like it's like analogous to a symbol, where there's the bottom is the body and the top is heaven.
So we talk about understanding. We've been talking about it. That's weird because we've changed the metaphor. It's now understanding, although it used to be interstanding, standing between people. But I hope you still grasp what I'm saying. I hope you see my point. I hope you get it. You notice all the words you're using for understanding? They're images, but you're not looking at them. When you're like, a little kid might do that. A 3-year-old, you say, do you see my point? And they might look around. But you don't look at that. You look through it to this hard to get a hold of thing, understanding. You're doing it all the time. In fact, and now I'm going to sort of call it out, your language is filled with metaphors, such that you can't go very far through a statement without coming up against the fact that you're facing the reality of metaphors. But I hope that point wasn't too hard for you to take. You're doing poetry all day long, and you not only do it with visual images, although you're not picturing anything when you're doing this. You see how it's imaginal? But you also do it enacted, so you're knowing I'm doing this weird stuff with my hands. This is not ornamental. If I limit your ability to gesture, your ability to solve problems and communicate will go down, and your ability to be understood goes down. So we've got this idea of seeing through, finding the through line. We've got the idea of the imaginal is that we can use imagination not to take us away from perception, but to sensitize us, enhance our perception and our conception. And that we're already always naturally doing that.
Something, I have like some sort of thing to communicate.
You got something to say. You don't quite know how to say it.
Yes.
I want to see what it is.
I actually think it might be inarticulable, like entirely, in the sense that you have to experience it and and like see it, and you know, that's when
eye contact. And so now there's this back and forth, this loop, right? This psychodynamic loop that's occurring. Now that's a conversation. Some conversations I think are just not really meant to be had. And I think this is one of them. It just wasn't a useful conversation. Unfortunately, it wasn't a useful conversation. Now, I know that they can have a useful conversation, but it's got to be on a topic, on a subject that they're both having enough of that, they're having enough optimal grip on the topic itself so that there can be that exchange of ideas. Because otherwise we're just talking past each other, and we're doing, I guess we're just doing some Darwinian jiggling.
Love me. Do you pull out the chains, or do you push into constant aching each and every day? Do you wish that you loved me?